Hello everyone, and welcome back to Prince Elsen's Ride. This is part 3, and I'm Hannah Steenbock, German author, writer, and dragon lover. I'll continue the story right now. Both young men sat in silence for a while, sitting close to the cliff edge until Garrick suddenly jumped up. Elsen frowned at him. What? Ants in my pants and boot! Garrick hopped around on one foot, looking at Elsen, trying to pull the boot off. Elsen jumped up as well. Be careful, he yelled, as his friend's hopping brought him closer to the cliff edge. Just as Garrick got the boot off, the cliff edge crumbled underneath him. Elsen lunged and managed to grab Garrick's arm just as the young man slipped. He dangled, both legs hanging over the cliff. Elsen was stretched out on the grassy ground, clinging to his friend's arm. He slipped very slightly and dug in his toes, quivering in the effort to keep his friend alive. How would he ever drag him back up? He could barely hold him in place, and his arms were already aching. Fing in! Garrick yelled, at the same time as Elsen sent an urgent thought to the dragon. I can't hold you much longer, Elsen gasped. I'm coming. Garrick struggled to get a foothold and scrabbled in the dirt with his free hand, desperation in his eyes. Elsen slipped a little and dug his toes in again. Suddenly, the young Dragonrider's sleeve tore, and Elsen lost his hold on Garrick's arm. Garrick dropped without making a sound. Elsen screamed, Garrick! No! The dragon landed on the ground below the cliff, bellowing in distress. No, no, no! Elsen scuttled back from the cliff edge, dashed tears from his eyes, and looked around. There was no easy way to get down. Fing in! He screamed. Fing in! He picked up the dragon's harness and stood straight. That was the only way to get down to Garrick quickly and safely, if he could make the dragon listen. Fing in! Nothing. Fing in! Elsen sank back to the ground. How could he ever reach the dragon through his distress? He picked up Garrick's boot, crawled to the cliff edge, and launched it into the air. It fell in an arc and bounced off the dragon's back. No reaction. Elsen wondered if the dragon had even felt the impact. In desperation, he tried once again to reach the dragon with his mind. Instead of an answer, panic flooded him. He shuddered, sank to his knees, closed his eyes, and took several deep breaths. It didn't help. Wave after wave of panic rolled through him. Elsen curled into a ball, suppressing a whimper. Rough heather scratched his cheek. He flinched. Panic receded a little. He pressed his cheek into the heather. That sting was better than panic, better than quaking in fear. He felt a little more like himself and lifted his head. The sun shone down on him, utterly unconcerned. Clouds soared overhead, dotted with seagulls. A moan drifted up to him, and with a flash, Elsen pulled himself back onto his knees. Garrick! He needed to get down to Garrick. Once again, he crawled to the cliff edge, doing his best to ignore the distraught dragon on the beach below. He needed a way down that wouldn't kill him. Far in the distance to his right, the cliff dipped lower. It was his only chance. Elsen got up and ran, keeping a careful distance from the cliff edge. Soon he was winded, a stitch in his side. He gritted his teeth and kept running until the pain forced him to stop. He kept walking, hand pressed into his side. He growled at his protective mother, keeping him inside the palace with no chance to build stamina or strength. As soon as the stitch eased, he broke into a trot again. The cliff curved towards the ocean and pulled back in. The sun glistened off the waves. The sound of the breakers washed up to Elsen. He didn't care, had no eye for the beauty. He ran and walked and ran, losing any sense of time, until he reached that dip he had seen. Panting hard, he gingerly stepped up to the cliff's edge. There was no easy way down, and a few boulders lying at the bottom of the cliff signaled clear dangers. Elsen had no choice. This was the only way down. It would be even more dangerous in other places. He sat at the edge of the cliff, in a place where no boulder loomed directly underneath. With a bit of luck, he could slide down the steep incline. Elsen took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped sweat from his brow, and pushed himself off. A moment later, he tumbled down the steep slope with no control whatsoever. Sand and dirt were flying everywhere, getting into his nose and eyes under his clothes while he rolled, completely disoriented. He came to a stop with a thud, slamming into the ground of the beach. The impact drove all air out of his lungs, and for a long moment, darkness hovered while he struggled to breathe. When he managed to open his eyes, he shuddered at the sight of a craggy boulder only an arm's length away from his head. But there was no time to waste. Elsen pushed himself up on his knees and then used the boulder to pull himself onto his feet. The world hadn't quite stopped revolving around him, but Garrick needed him. He lurched around the boulder, and when the world steadied, he ran again. He soon realized that running was much easier close to the waterline where the sand was wet and hard. Something tickled his temple, and he wiped it with his hand. It came away sticky with blood. Elsen stared as the cut on his temple started to burn. He gritted his teeth, wiped his hand on his shirt, and ran on. Obviously, he had struck his head on something during the tumble, but that couldn't stop him. Once again, he ignored the stitch in his side, pressing his hand against his ribs, stumbling on. He had to reach Garrick. Finally, he could make out Fingin's large shape on the beach. He forced himself into a sprint, gasping for breath. When he had almost reached the dragon and his rider, he stumbled and lacked the strength to stay on his feet. He tumbled into the sand, and saw stars for a moment. And I'm going to end it here. Obviously, we're getting closer to a rescue, and I'll continue this tomorrow. Let's see. And here we go. Bye for now.